Imagine waking up one day and realizing that every challenge you have faced, every illness you have endured, and every moment filled with confusion and pain originates from a single terrifying reality that is not even your fault. You come to understand that your shaking hands, your difficulty in breathing, and your foggy thoughts all have roots in choices made long before you were born. Your parents, motivated by an obsession with maintaining pure bloodlines, have doomed you to a life full of suffering. You find out that your mother is also your cousin, your father is your uncle, and your grandmother doubles as your great aunt. The family tree is not a branching network, but a tangled vine that strangles itself. You are not the result of love, but the outcome of a carefully planned breeding program aimed at securing power and fortune without any concern for the human price. This is not a fictional tale. It is the harsh reality for numerous women throughout history who were caught in a complex web of genetic fate they never agreed to. Before we delve into these overlooked stories of endurance and pain, if you appreciate uncovering hidden historical truths, please press the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Also, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from. It is truly amazing that together from different corners of the world, we explore these ancient narratives connected through our common fascination with history. To truly grasp these women's experiences, we first need to understand the context. A distorted mindset was behind their centuries of suffering. European royalty believed that marrying within their own bloodlines would safeguard their divine right to rule. They considered their noble blood fundamentally unlike that of ordinary people, viewing it as purer, more sacred, and blessed directly by God Himself. This tradition became so widespread that by the 16th century, royal families across Europe had become an extensive network of relatives marrying one another. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and siblings produced heirs destined to govern empires. What they failed to grasp was the genetic nightmare they were creating, one that would reverberate through generations. The Habsburg family of Austria and Spain refined this tragic practice to a lethal perfection. Their family motto might have read, "Let others fight wars. You, fortunate Austria, marry." Yet their unions brought no happiness, but were deliberate breeding disasters that led to some of history's most sorrowful figures. Our first account brings us to Vienna in the year 1634. Within the shadowy halls of Hofburg Palace, a child was born who would never feel a day without suffering. Mary Anne of Austria entered life burdened by the Habsburg curse, encoded in her DNA, a legacy of many generations of cousin marriages. Her family tree was so convoluted it resembled a noose. From her earliest moments, Mary Anne recognized her difference. While other children ran and played, she struggled simply to walk. Her spine curved unnaturally, forcing her into a painful posture. Her stooped posture makes breathing a real challenge, and her jaw juts out so prominently that eating solid food is nearly impossible. Servants have to slice her meat into tiny fragments, and even then mealtimes become tiresome rituals of slow chewing and careful swallowing. However, Mary Anne's physical hardships fade in comparison to the mental anguish of understanding why she endures such suffering. She grows up surrounded by portraits of her forebears, and in each painted face she sees reflections of her own deformities. There is an uncle with the same jutting jaw, a grandmother with an identical curved spine. This brings a grim awareness that she is not singular in her plight, but the latest in a long chain of genetic misfortune. The court doctors, with their rituals of bloodletting and prayer, fail to ease her pain. They murmur quietly about the Habsburg curse, but never speak of it openly to her. They refer to vague illnesses and divine fate, but never admit the harsh truth known to all, except spoken aloud, that her agony results directly from her parents' and grandparents' obsession with preserving a pure bloodline. Mary Anne spends her days confined to dimly lit chambers, the curtains drawn to shield both herself from the world and the world from her. She devours books with fierce determination, her keen intellect one of the few aspects of her body that functions well. In these pages, she discovers realms where lineage holds no power and where people are free from such burdens. Marrying for love rather than heritage would mean children would not inherit the burdens of their ancestors deep within their very bones. Yet reality always has a way of breaking in. Court physicians conduct regular examinations of her, recording her physical abnormalities with detached precision. They assess the curvature of her spine, the jutting of her jaw, and the frailty of her limbs. She becomes more than a person. She turns into a clinical subject, a living demonstration of the consequences when genetics take a tragic turn. The isolation she endures is perhaps even more unbearable than the physical suffering. Potential suitors, who are all her cousins, shrink away upon seeing her. Marriage talks begin and end swiftly once her condition becomes public. She remains unmarried not by her own choice, but due to the situation. Even in a society where cousin marriage is common, her deformities prove too pronounced to ignore. Mary Ann passes away prematurely at the age of 32, her body finally giving in to the accumulated toll of genetic damage. Although her death certificate mentions several ailments, the true cause is never officially acknowledged. She died because successive generations of her forebears valued power above humanity and purity above empathy. Leaving Austria behind, our narrative shifts to Spain, centering on perhaps the most sorrowful figure in this grim saga, Joanna of Castile. Known in history as Joanna the Mad or Juana la Loca, she was born in the year 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs responsible for expelling Jews and Muslims from Spain and financing Columbus's expeditions. Joanna appeared destined for greatness, but her life turned into a warning about the heavy cost of preserving bloodlines. Pure Joanna's instability was not evident during her early years. She was intelligent and well-educated, fluent in several languages. However, the roots of her downfall were already embedded in her genetics. Her parents were cousins, part of the tightly woven network of European royalty, who had intermarried for many generations. The earliest signs of her decline appeared after she wed Philip, the Handsome of Burgundy. This marriage was arranged to reinforce political ties, but turned into a psychological struggle. Philip was unfaithful, cold, and manipulative. Joanna's reaction was an intense and obsessive love that many mistook for madness. Yet was it truly madness, or simply the natural response of a woman trapped in an unbearable situation? Mary Ann had been brought up to consider marriage her highest purpose, with producing heirs as her sacred responsibility. When that union became a constant source of humiliation and suffering, her mind began to break under the immense strain. The true tragedy unfolded when Philip died unexpectedly in 1506. Joanna's sorrow transformed into something darker and more obsessive. She refused to let him be buried, traveling around Spain with his coffin, regularly opening it to kiss his decaying body. This disturbing behavior reveals a deeper truth about her state. She had been so isolated and deprived of genuine human connection that even death could not sever her bond with the only person who ever paid her attention, however cruel her father Ferdinand and later others may have been. Her son Charles V used her alleged insanity as a reason to confine her for 46 years. Mary Ann lived locked away in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Torrillas under terrible conditions. She was held in dark and cold chambers, given very little food, and denied basic cleanliness. Those who cared for her mentioned that she could go weeks without washing, would tear her garments to pieces, and sometimes scream for hours on end. But the essential question remains, was Mary Ann truly insane, or was she driven mad by her environment? Modern scholars increasingly think her madness was mainly a political tool, a handy reason to remove a rightful queen from authority. Her actions, though extreme, can be seen as natural reactions of a person enduring intense depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress worsened by many years of solitude and mistreatment. The hereditary factor must also be considered. Mary Ann's family history reveals clear signs of mental illnesses like depression and anxiety, which tend to worsen and become more frequent due to close-kin marriages. Her great-great-grandmother suffered similar episodes, and her daughter Catherine later displayed severe depressive symptoms. The pattern was obvious to those who chose to recognize it. Mary Ann passed away in 1555, still behind bars, and officially declared insane. Her death received little attention, as she had been erased from collective memory long before, dismissed as a troublesome madwoman instead of being seen as a casualty of a system that prioritized politics over justice, convenience prioritized over human well-being. Our next tale takes place in the resplendent chambers of the Spanish palace, where a young girl named Mary Ann bears the burdens of an empire within her delicate frame. Born in the year 1651, she is the offspring of Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria. Indeed, his niece, for by this era the Habsburg lineage had become so intertwined through close family marriages that uncles repeatedly wedded their brothers' daughters, and such unions were seen as entirely normal. Mary Ann's early years are captured in remarkable detail by the brushstrokes of Diego Velázquez, the official artist to the Spanish monarchs. These stunning works reveal a child who ought to be enjoying simple play, but instead is clad in extravagant royal attire. Her small visage already reveals unmistakable signs of the genetic afflictions common within the Habsburg family. Observe closely Velázquez's paintings, and you will discern what the painter was too tactful to highlight, yet too truthful to fully conceal. Mary Ann's lower jaw juts forward slightly, enough to indicate the harsh disfigurements that would worsen over time. Her eyes carry a remote, almost empty expression hinting at developmental challenges, and even her childhood stance suggests the spinal troubles that afflicted her lineage. However, the cruelest part of Mary Ann's existence is not her condition, but rather the utter absence of control regarding her own destiny. From the moment of her birth, every choice about her future was decided by others. Mary Ann is viewed by men not as an individual, but as a political asset. While still a toddler, she is promised in marriage to her uncle Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. This engagement is heralded throughout Europe as a major diplomatic victory. No one stops to think about what this arrangement means for the young girl at its center. Mary Ann grows up fully aware that her sole role is to wed her uncle and bear heirs to sustain the Habsburg lineage. She receives the finest education accessible to women of her era. She learns multiple languages, masters musical instruments, dances gracefully, and paints skillfully. Yet all these talents are seen only as ways to make her a more appealing bride for her uncle. The wedding takes place in the year 1666, when Mary Ann is merely 15 years old. Leopold is 26, old enough to be her father and literally her father's brother. The ceremony is marked by lavish events and grand public celebrations, but for Mary Ann, it signals the loss of whatever childhood remained. The physical reality of her marriage emerges only in hints within court documents, never fully described. Mary Ann is expected to conceive immediately, despite her youth and delicate health. The pressure is overwhelming because the fate of the Habsburg dynasty rests upon her ability to provide healthy children. She becomes pregnant several times, yet these pregnancies end in tragedy. Her first child, a daughter, survives only a few months. Her second pregnancy ends in miscarriage until she finally delivers a son who survives infancy. The sense of relief at court is undeniable, but it soon becomes apparent that the child carries the full range of Habsburg hereditary ailments. Mary Ann Teresa herself weakens with every pregnancy. The combination of consanguinity-related health issues and the immense physical burden of continuous childbirth severely affects her body. She endures what modern medicine would identify as extreme anemia, respiratory complications, and perhaps epilepsy. The court doctors record her deterioration with clinical accuracy. They observe her growing struggles with speech, regular seizures, and an inability to retain food, but they never attribute these signs to the obvious reason: the genetic damage from generations of inbreeding. Mary Ann Teresa passes away in 1673, only 6 years after her wedding, at the age of 21. Official documents cite fever as the cause of death, yet the truth is that her body collapsed under the cumulative strain of hereditary defects and physical exhaustion. While her demise is grieved across the empire, the reasons are sadly misplaced. Courtiers and diplomats mourn the loss of a future heir rather than the tragic fate of a young woman sacrificed to uphold a bloodline already deeply corrupted. Our story now moves to the dazzling Versailles court, where beneath the grand ceremonies and splendid buildings, a princess named Mary Anne of Austria faces the unseen burdens tied to her Habsburg lineage. Born in the year 6001, she is the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. This is yet another instance of an uncle and niece union, a practice regarded not only as usual, but even preferred among European monarchs. Mary Anne's early years in Madrid follow the well-known pattern of royal intermarriage with its resulting outcomes. As a child, she matures slowly, showing the familiar learning challenges that affected many Habsburg heirs. Her lower jaw noticeably protrudes, making it difficult for her to speak clearly and causing feeding to be a strenuous task. Most sorrowfully, she displays signs that today would be understood as severe anxiety and depression, illnesses that turn her everyday existence into an ongoing battle. In the year 1615, when Mary Anne is 14 years old, she marries Louis XIII of France within a complicated diplomatic agreement. The purpose of this marriage is to establish peace between Spain and France, two nations long engaged in conflict for many years. What nobody takes into account is the toll this takes on Mary Anne's mental health. She is ripped away from all that is familiar and placed within a strange court where immediate adjustment to unfamiliar traditions, a foreign language, and her new position as queen is expected. The French court greets her at first with grand festivities, but the harsh truth of her circumstances quickly becomes clear. Louis XIII is a distant and cold spouse who exhibits little concern for his young wife. He struggles with his own mental struggles, as modern experts suggest. Mary Anne struggled with deep depression and possible same-sex attraction during a time when such emotions were neither recognized nor accepted. Caught between conflicting demands as Queen of France, she was pressured to produce male successors to secure the throne. Yet as a member of the Habsburg family, she inherited genetic complications that made bearing healthy children extremely challenging. Her initial pregnancies tragically ended in miscarriages or infant fatalities, each loss amplifying her sadness and anxiety. Physicians at court, guided by the medical knowledge of their era, blamed Mary Anne for these repeated failures. They subjected her to harsh and degrading treatments, including bloodletting, purging, and strange dietary rules. Her private areas were frequently examined for signs of what they termed defects in her womanhood. No one considered that the true cause might stem from inherited genetic problems caused by generations of closely related marriages. As years passed without a surviving heir, Mary Anne's isolation grew deeper. She became the subject of palace rumors and political schemes. Nobles murmured that she was cursed, that divine disapproval fell on the Spanish marriage, and that France deserved a different queen. The mounting pressure caused Mary Anne to develop symptoms that modern doctors would identify as extreme agoraphobia. She grew fearful of public appearances and spent extended periods secluded in her private chambers. At the same time, her relationship with King Louis XIII deteriorated further as both parties struggled under these relentless burdens. As they hold each other accountable for their inability to have children, their lives drift apart, intersecting only when the strict rules of the court demand it. Mary Anne turns to faith for solace, dedicating countless hours to prayer and developing a nearly obsessive attachment to Catholic ceremonies. When the long-awaited miracle arrives, it almost feels unreal. After 23 years of marriage, Mary Anne gives birth to a healthy boy, the future Louis XIV, known as the Sun King. The birth is celebrated all over France as a divine blessing, yet for Mary Anne, it brings both victory and fresh fears. She understands that her worth primarily depends on her ability to bear heirs, and now she must face the pressure to once again succeed. 2 years later, Philip is born, ensuring the royal succession and finally easing some of the relentless stress weighing on Marianne. However, the physical and emotional consequences of her prolonged struggles cannot be erased. She continues to live as a profoundly anxious and melancholic woman, finding little happiness even in her ultimate achievement as a mother. Her later years are overshadowed by worsening health problems, including digestive troubles, respiratory difficulties, and what court physicians referred to as melancholy episodes, which would confine her to bed for several days at a time. Modern interpretations suggest she suffered from inherited anxiety disorders and depression common in Habsburg lineage, conditions worsened by the traumatic experiences she endured early in her marriage. Marianne passed away in the year 1666. Having survived her husband and witnessed her son rise to become one of Europe's most dominant rulers, Marianne's legacy is not the political triumph celebrated by history. Instead, it reveals the emotional toll of a system that regarded women merely as reproductive vessels and overlooked the genetic impact of dynastic unions. While Marianne is largely known for her involvement in the French Revolution, her narrative is deeply intertwined with the Habsburg tradition of inbreeding and its repercussions. Born in the year 1755, she was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Although their marriage was not as closely entangled as other Habsburg alliances, it still carried the inherited genetic weight of generations of cousin marriages. Arriving in France at the age of 14 as a bride, Marianne brought with her not only the aspirations of the Austrian-French alliance, but also the concealed burden of the Habsburg genetic legacy. Her renowned portraits by painters like Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun depict a striking woman, yet they subtly hint at hereditary features. The slightly protruding lower lip and the unmistakable Habsburg jawline that became increasingly prominent with each generation of intermarriage. However, Marianne's true hardships were not immediately apparent. Like many descendants of the Habsburg family, she endured what the royal doctors labeled as feminine ailments, severe menstrual troubles, frequent miscarriages, and other health difficulties. What modern medicine would identify as hormonal imbalances, likely rooted in genetic causes, affected her deeply. Marianne's marriage to the future King Louis XVI faced difficulties from the very start, but not in the way gossip suggested. Both individuals were confronting the burdens of their own inherited genetics. Louis XVI exhibited signs of developmental delays and social discomfort that hindered closeness, while Marianne wrestled with anxiety and depression that had been a recurring issue among Habsburg women over many generations. The demand to produce an heir was overwhelming. For 7 years, the couple's relationship remained unconsummated, fueling harsh rumors about both of them. Court doctors frequently examined Marianne, searching for physical explanations for their inability to conceive. What remained unknown at the time was that both partners were battling psychological and possibly physical challenges linked to their inbred backgrounds. When Marianne eventually became pregnant, her struggles did not end there. Her initial pregnancy was dominated by extreme morning sickness, panic episodes, and what today would be called prenatal depression. Her daughter Marie Theresa arrived healthy, yet later pregnancies were accompanied by miscarriages and infant deaths, inflicting profound emotional suffering. The most heartbreaking part of Marianne's narrative is how her genetic legacy intertwined with the disastrous political upheaval of the French Revolution. Her ongoing anxiety and depression were likely intensified by the effects of inbreeding compounded by the era's turmoil. Hormonal imbalances made it challenging for Marianne to manage the intricate political turmoil unfolding around her. Her inclination toward rash choices and emotional outbursts, traits that might have been controlled in a stable political setting, turned into critical weaknesses as France plunged into revolution. Courtiers observed her increasingly unpredictable behavior as the crisis deepened. She would alternate between episodes of intense activity and profound sadness, unable to sustain the steady political discernment required during such a critical time. Contemporary scholars argue whether her mood fluctuations were solely a response to circumstances or indicated deeper psychiatric issues often seen in Habsburg genealogy. The notorious expression, "let them eat cake," which she most likely never actually uttered, illustrates how her adversaries exploited what could have been signs of hereditary mental health struggles to depict her as heartless and detached. The true tragedy was not her cruelty, but quite the contrary. She was overcome by the widespread suffering and lacked the psychological resilience to cope well during her captivity and trial. Marianne demonstrated extraordinary bravery, but also showed evidence of dissociative episodes, similar to those experienced by other Habsburg women under intense stress. Guards reported her moments of apparent bewilderment, difficulty concentrating during questioning, and a tendency to withdraw inwardly when confronted with immense pressure. Her execution marked the end of a tragic story, shaped by inner turmoil and external chaos. The year 1793 marked not only the end of a life, but also the conclusion of a genetic lineage that had influenced European history for many centuries. In her last moments, Marianne reportedly displayed the grace and composure that had long defined her character, yet also a deep sense of acceptance, characteristic of someone who never completely grasped why her existence had been so burdened. To truly comprehend the extent of the Habsburg genetic tragedy, we must look beyond individual women and consider entire generations wiped out by the custom of close-kin marriages. The Spanish infantas from the late 17th and early 18th centuries stand as perhaps the most intense example of genetic disaster in European royal lineages. These were the daughters and granddaughters of Charles II of Spain, himself so inbred that his genetic coefficient, a measure indicating how closely related his parents were, exceeded that of offspring born to brother and sister unions. Charles II was impotent, suffered from epilepsy, and likely had mental disabilities, the cumulative outcome of 16 generations of Habsburg intermarriage. However, Charles II's sisters and female cousins, the infantas, endured even greater hardships because they were expected to marry and bear children. Their histories resemble medical case reports illustrating the effects of genetic seclusion. Marianne Margarita, born in 1651, showed serious developmental delays from an early age. Court documents depict a child unable to speak clearly until around 7 years old, struggling to walk, and exhibiting early indications of, long before modern medicine identified what we now call autism spectrum disorders. Marianne exhibited traits that fit this description, yet she remained deemed suitable for marriage due to her noble lineage. Her sister Mary Teresa displayed a different set of equally heartbreaking symptoms. She was diagnosed by court physicians with what they called falling sickness, unquestionably epilepsy, and suffered such intense respiratory difficulties that climbing stairs was nearly impossible. Mary Teresa's jaw was so severely deformed that she could only consume liquids, and her spine was curved significantly, requiring support to maintain an upright posture. These sisters were raised in the Alcazar of Madrid, a palace that had shifted more into a hospital than a royal dwelling. Teams of doctors, surgeons, and priests looked after various royal children, all affected by diverse symptoms stemming from the same underlying genetic disaster. The medical records from this era read like a detailed anatomy of the devastating effects of inbreeding, epilepsy, developmental delays, physical deformities, immune deficiencies, and mental health disorders. Despite these hardships, these women were still expected to perform their royal duty, which was to produce heirs. Marriage negotiations pursued relentlessly, even though it was clear that they were not physically fit for childbirth. European courts carefully examined thorough medical reports about their conditions, not out of concern for their health, but to determine their value as procreative assets. Ultimately, Mary Margarita was wed to her cousin Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, continuing a cycle dictated by bloodline, ambitions rather than personal well-being. The Roman emperor, the same individual who had once been married to Margaret Theresa, experienced a marriage that was doomed from the start. Marianne Margarita's developmental challenges made it impossible for her to grasp her marital responsibilities. Her physical difficulties rendered consummation incredibly challenging. The psychological torment of these circumstances cannot be overstated. These women were raised with the understanding that their sole worth was tied to their ability to give birth. However, their genetic background made the possibility of delivering healthy children nearly unattainable. They lived in constant dread of pregnancy, fully aware that each conception endangered not only their own survival, but probably resulted in offspring even more afflicted than themselves. Court documents from this era expose the heartbreaking human toll in vivid detail. Correspondence among royal women speaks of miscarriages, infant fatalities, and the persistent dread that accompanied every pregnancy. They recount births of children so severely malformed that survival outside the womb was impossible, and others who lived only a few days or weeks before succumbing to inherited disorders. The mental effects were overwhelming. Many of these women developed what today's psychiatry would identify as intense anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress. They became withdrawn, fearful of public appearance, deeply ashamed of their looks and their perceived failures as spouses and mothers. Most painfully, they often placed blame on themselves for their inability to bear healthy heirs due to their genetic legacy. Scientific knowledge that could clarify their condition would only emerge centuries later, so they perceived their difficulties as personal shortcomings or divine retribution. This self-blame added an extra burden to lives already filled with physical and emotional anguish. To truly grasp the experiences of these women, we need to explore the genetic science behind their suffering. When closely related people have children, there is a greater probability that the offspring will inherit 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In a healthy, genetically varied group, these damaging genes are often suppressed by normal copies received from unrelated parents. However, when cousins marry cousins repeatedly, as the Habsburgs did for many generations, these harmful genes accumulate and intensify. Each subsequent generation becomes more prone to exhibiting genetic disorders that would normally remain hidden. This process, known as inbreeding depression, impacts not only physical characteristics, but also mental well-being, immune system performance, and fertility. One of the most recognizable signs of this genetic buildup is the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism. This feature became increasingly noticeable with each generation of close relative marriages, eventually reaching such an extreme that some Habsburg heirs could not properly close their mouths or chew solid foods. However, these visible deformities represented only a small part of the problem. Contemporary genetic studies indicate that Habsburg descendants also endured heightened levels of various other health complications. Epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, depression, and weakened immune systems were common among royal women. Many of these puzzling ailments were probably autoimmune diseases triggered by genetic damage. The fertility issues experienced by numerous Habsburg women can also be attributed to genetic factors. Inbreeding raises the chance of genetic incompatibilities that complicate conception and threaten the safety of pregnancies. The elevated rates of miscarriages and infant deaths in Habsburg families were not simply due to a lack of medical knowledge, but were the unavoidable consequences of genetic harm accumulating over many generations. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect involves the mental health struggles faced by women such as Joanna of Castile and Marie Antoinette. Their psychological challenges can be better understood as inherited vulnerabilities to mental illnesses brought on by environmental stress. These women were not intrinsically insane. Rather, they had genetic susceptibilities to anxiety and depression, conditions worsened by the overwhelming demands of their royal responsibilities. What amplifies the tragedy is how this cycle was allowed to continue, even with clear proof of its damaging effects. Royal courts maintained thorough records detailing the health difficulties associated with inbreeding. yet they persisted in arranging marriages between cousins to secure political gains. Court doctors prepared comprehensive accounts of the physical and mental issues affecting royal offspring, but these findings were largely dismissed as routine medical observations. Rather than serving as warnings about genetic harm, the connection between inbreeding and health issues was clear to anyone willing to acknowledge it. However, political and economic interests always outweighed concern for human well-being. The Catholic Church, which might have intervened by denying approval for such close relative marriages, instead granted dispensations that made even the most genetically risky unions both legally and religiously permissible. The Church maintained that royal bloodlines were divinely chosen, and that maintaining their purity mattered more than preventing human suffering. Even the women involved sometimes supported this system because they had been raised to believe that their royal lineage made them superior to ordinary people. Some actively pursued marriages within their own family to protect what they believed was their genetic legacy, unaware that they were in fact contributing to their own genetic decline. The most tragic part of this ongoing cycle is how each generation of women held on to the hope that their children would be different, that somehow their descendants would escape the hereditary curse haunting their families for centuries. They endured countless pregnancies and repeated miscarriages, clinging desperately to the belief that the next child would be born healthy. The Habsburg genetic experiment ultimately concluded with the death of Charles II of Spain in the year 1700. The absence of heirs ignited the War of Spanish Succession. Charles II had such severe genetic damage that he was impotent and possibly mentally impaired. This tragic conclusion was the result of countless generations of close familial marriages. His passing signified not only the termination of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, but also marked the start of a gradual awareness that royal intermarriage was unsustainable. Although cousin marriages persisted among European nobility, they became less frequent and involved more distant relatives, as courts began recognizing the genetic dangers involved. The women whose lives we have examined were victims of a system that prioritized political expediency over human well-being and genetic purity over genetic soundness. They endured suffering and death not due to personal faults or divine wrath, but because their forebears made decisions favoring short-term political gains above long-term genetic impact. Their legacy is more than just a historical record of their pain. It is the scientific knowledge advanced by analyzing their conditions. Modern genetics owes a great deal to the sorrowful Habsburg case of interfamily breeding, as their affliction helped clarify how genes function and why maintaining genetic diversity is crucial for human health. Although widespread royal intermarriage like this is mostly a thing of the past, the underlying forces that caused such tragedies still remain in different forms. Isolated communities worldwide continue cousin marriages, often leading to comparable genetic risks. This persistent dilemma between maintaining cultural or social practices and safeguarding genetic health remains unresolved in many parts of the world. The tension between maintaining cultural customs and safeguarding genetic health continues to emerge in many situations. More broadly, these narratives warn us about the risks of regarding people as mere tools to achieve an objective, rather than as unique individuals worthy of respect and autonomy. The Habsburg women were seen only through the lens of reproduction, appreciated solely for their role in producing male successors and continuing family lines. Their personal wishes, needs, and well-being were always put behind political agendas. Such dehumanization is not limited to historical royal courts. Throughout history, and even now, women have often been valued only for their childbearing abilities, their worth tied to producing offspring to serve the interests of others. The Habsburg case presents a severe example of a pattern that still exists globally in various forms. As we close these sorrowful chapters, we must face a difficult reality. The anguish endured by these women served a purpose, although not the one their oppressors intended. Their suffering, recorded in legal documents and medical studies, became vital evidence for the emergence of modern genetics. The Habsburg genetic case, as terrible as it was for those involved, offered science valuable insights into the effects of inbreeding. Our current knowledge of recessive genes, genetic variety, and hereditary disease patterns partly grew from examining the tragic consequences of cousin marriages in royal families. While this does not excuse their actions, it shaped scientific progress in genetics. This does not lessen or undermine the severity of their suffering, but it shows that their pain carried significance. The insights gained from examining their conditions have played a crucial role in preventing similar misfortunes and have advanced our comprehension of human genetics. The women we have explored: Mary Anne of Austria, Joanna of Castile, Margaret Teresa of Spain, Anna of Austria, Marie Antoinette, and the overlooked Spanish infantas, were genuine individuals who experienced genuine hardships. They were not merely historical side notes or subjects for genetic analysis. They were daughters, spouses, mothers, and human beings deserving of more than the cruel destinies shaped by genetics and political agendas. Their narratives remind us of the critical need to prioritize human welfare over political convenience, to honor the intrinsic dignity in every person regardless of rank, and to remember that even the mightiest institutions can inflict great pain when they lose sight of fundamental human values. Let us return to the moment of dreadful discovery we envisioned earlier, waking up to find your entire existence molded by choices made before your birth by ancestors who prized bloodline purity above well-being. For the women whose lives we examined, this was not imagination but a constant reality. They endured the knowledge that their physical suffering, mental torment, reproductive struggles, and societal isolation all originated from a single cause: a genetic inheritance tainted by generations of close relative breeding they bore. It was not only their own agony, but also the heavy burden of centuries of misguided choices made by people who should have known better. Yet within their pain, there is something deeply revealing about human strength in the face of hardship. Numerous women in this lineage discovered ways to claim their dignity. Mary Anne became an academic, finding freedom of the mind despite a body that confined her. Joanna kept her passionate love alive, even while descending into madness. Margaret Teresa endured her pain with grace. Anna found comfort through faith. Marie Antoinette confronted death bravely. Their experiences remind us that even amid the bleakest situations, the human soul can still seek to affirm its value. They also call attention to our duty to learn from their suffering and make sure that the pursuit of political, economic, or social ambitions never again results in the deliberate destruction of people's humanity. The curse of preserving bloodlines through purity has finally ceased, at least in its most severe forms, but the memory of these women and their agonies remains as a powerful reminder of the cost of placing ideology above human dignity, tradition above empathy, and power above love. Ultimately, their heritage is both sorrowful and hopeful. Sorrowful because their pain could have been avoided, hopeful because their stories help prevent the repetition of such systematic cruelty. The pursuit of genetic destruction in the name of royal purity will never be tolerated again. They sacrificed everything so that we could understand a vital truth their ancestors could not accept. Human value is not determined by lineage, and true honor does not stem from genetic perfection, but from the bravery to recognize our shared humanity. Even though their voices were silenced by both death and the passage of time, their message continues to resonate through the ages with clear and profound meaning. Remember us, not for our royal ranks or political roles, but as individuals who deserved more than the cruel destiny crafted by genetics and politics. Remember us, and let our pain teach you, so that no one else will have to suffer the burden of maintaining